Let's talk about sort of the three basic economic questions of what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce that exist in every country's economy. And let's focus just on what those questions look like in the three countries we've really been focusing on in Africa. Let's start with South Africa. So when it comes to South Africa, what do they produce? How do they answer that question of what to produce? Well, most of South Africa's GDP, that's their gross domestic product, the amount of money they make in a year, based on their goods and their services that they sell, it comes from privately owned businesses. And these businesses are usually mining businesses. They might be gold mines, agriculture, so farming businesses, services. In South Africa, it's a very developed economy. There's doctors, there's lawyers, there's all sorts of services, and manufacturing. They make things in factories as well. The South African government has taken control basically of housing, business development, education, basic services, and healthcare in the country. So the government takes care of all of that in an effort to remedy the inequitable, that means the unequal, distribution of resources during apartheid. So in order to make sure that everyone has healthcare, everyone has education, everyone has a place to live, regardless of their race, the government has taken over that task to make sure that's fair. When it comes to how they produce in South Africa, in the developed section, private businesses and consumers make the decisions of what they want to produce and how they want to produce it. So it's very sort of very market economy. They base this on how the market's doing, whether there's a lot of supply and demand for a product, and how much materials cost and how much they'll be able to sell it for on the world market. They use all those considerations when they decide how to produce something, and they have the freedom to do that without a lot of government intervention. Social services, though, the healthcare, the education, the government makes a decision on how to produce those. And for whom to produce, when we talk about privately owned businesses, the private sector, in other words, produces goods and services for both domestic, that means people living in South Africa, as well as international markets. That means people around the world who might want to buy their products based on whatever the prices are in the market around the world, the market price system. The government social services sector produces public goods and services based on the needs of South Africa's population. So all of the social services like healthcare and education and housing are made just for the South African people. So if we look at where South Africa lands on the continuum, they are somewhere in the middle. They're not pure command, they're not pure market, but they do lean more towards market. They're 62.3% market. They're a strong mixed market economy. Nigeria answers the question of what to produce with one word, oil. Their major industry is petroleum production, but they also do quite a bit of farming. They have a lot of agriculture. So farming, forestry, that sort of thing, all kind of falls into agriculture. However, there's some corruption and there's some ineffective government supervision that makes sort of developing strong businesses very difficult. It's estimated that as much as 75% of Nigeria's economy isn't counted into their GDP, that it's not counted. And again, we've looked at Nigeria, we looked at a video of Nigeria where we saw that they have a lot of oil, but they're still a very poor country because they don't have the refineries to produce that oil into a product that people will buy. They actually have to buy refined oil for themselves. So there are some things that Nigeria is working on to become a stronger economy. How does Nigeria produce? After years of government control, private companies are starting to take over many of Nigeria's major industries, including the petroleum or oil industry and the banking sector. However, again, corruption, high tariffs or taxes on imported goods, and a lack of infrastructure cause inefficiencies when it comes to producing. So they're not making as much as they could make. And for whom to produce in Nigeria? 46% of Nigeria's daily oil production, that's about half of the oil Nigeria makes in a day, gets sent to the United States, gets exported to the US. Nigerians import many goods, though, because their currency is overvalued. They're unable to compete with cheap imports, and many business owners have had to close. When we look at how Nigeria falls on the continuum, once again, they're mixed as well, but they're mixed and they're still leaning a little bit market, not as much as South Africa, but they are 57.1% market. Now, Kenya, what to produce? That question is answered mainly by farming, by agriculture. It dominates Kenya's economy. It includes things like forestry and fishing. It makes up about 24% of their total GDP. A quarter of the money they make each year comes from agriculture. They're a leading producer in the world of tea and coffee, and about 75% of Kenyans make their living by farming. So most people in Kenya have an agricultural job. They have made the export of manufactured goods as well, such as paper and vehicles, a priority, as well as tourism. So they're starting to bring in a few more services and goods besides just agriculture, but that is their main good that they produce. Kenya has both privately owned businesses as well as some run by the government. Most business is in private hands, is done by buyers and sellers without a lot of government intervention. There's a rise in oil prices happening. There's also been some droughts, and there's also been a real boom in population growth. The population has grown very quickly, and that has had a negative effect. Those things have had a negative effect on Kenya's economy and its people's standard of living. However, it is the most industrialized developed country in Eastern Africa. Not in all of Africa, but in the eastern side of Africa, it's very developed. But it could still develop quite a bit more. It has ways that it can still improve. And finally, who does Kenya produce for? It exports goods all over the world to the United States, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and throughout Africa as well, in places like Tanzania, its neighbor, Uganda. However, Kenya has a little bit of a trade deficit, which means they don't make as much money off of trading as they could, and people mainly think that's because they trade inexpensive goods that don't bring a lot of money into their country. When we look at where Kenya falls on the continuum, we see that they are kind of the farthest towards command. They're still mixed. They're still somewhere in between command and pure market. But with 53.5, they are mixed leaning market, but just slightly. When we look at them compared to Nigeria and South Africa's economies, they are the ones that lean the closest command, whereas South Africa leans the closest market, and the United States is on there just for comparison purposes. So you can see where we stand in comparison.